Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the recent military advances by the Sri Lankan government and the subsequent humanitarian crisis are of continuing serious concern. We have repeatedly called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. We've made clear to the government that a political solution that addresses the legitimate concerns of all communities in Sri Lanka is the only way to bring a sustainable end to the conflict. Our commitment to this goal and our desire to work with the Sri Lankan government is clear in the appointment of an experienced former Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Member for Kilmarnock, as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy. I remain in active discussion with the Sri Lankan government to encourage them to work with him.
Can I thank my right honourable friend for that answer, and can I also welcome the appointment of my right honourable friend, the member for Kilmarnock and Loudoun, as Special Envoy for Sri Lanka, and the statements that have been made in this House by members of the government regarding ceasefire. But I think warm words and good intentions will not protect the civilians of the Valley. My right honourable friend will be aware that in the last 24 hours a ceasefire offer has been made and rejected out of hand by the government of Sri Lanka. The situation is grave, with 2,000 civilian deaths since January. Is not now the time for the government to take this issue up at the highest levels, namely at a session of the UN Human Rights Council or at the Security Council itself, or by seeking suspension from the Commonwealth of the government of Sri Lanka?
Mr. Speaker, the situation is indeed extremely serious. For some time, the Sri Lankan authorities were offering a ceasefire and it was rejected by the LTTE. Now there is news of an LTTE offer which has been rejected by the government. She will have seen the very strong conclusions of the European General Affairs Council yesterday on the Sri Lankan issue, which I think are wholly appropriate and welcome. And she can be assured that we continue to press for humanitarian assistance and for a ceasefire at the highest levels.
Mr. Speaker, but further to his honourable friend, the member for Enfield North's point, will the Foreign Secretary explain to the House why the government hasn't sought a resolution at the United Nations Security Council for a ceasefire in Sri Lanka? Indeed, why, when Mexico recently asked for the Council to be briefed on Sri Lanka, did the British representative to the United Nations fail to support that call? Does the Minister realise that people get pretty angry when the UK ministers here in London talk about a ceasefire and call for a ceasefire, but British officials in New York don't follow through?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to hear the honourable gentleman talk in that way, because he knows that a failed resolution, because it faces a veto, is worse than no resolution at all. And it would strengthen precisely the forces that he and I oppose. And I can assure him that our diplomats, whether in New York or in the region, are all working off the same script, which is a script that has been set by the Prime Minister and myself.
Mr. Speaker, can the Foreign Secretary confirm that the problem in the Security Council is not the UK government, it's the Russian government, which refuses to support the Security Council resolution, and therefore, unlike in Gaza, we're unable to get the Security Council resolution that is so needed?
Mr. Speaker, there certainly is a blockage at the UN, and that is why the UN has not been able to opine on this issue.
Andrew Stunnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will know that there are credible reports of atrocities on both sides in this. Will he give the House an assurance that the British government will channel its energies on getting this ceasefire before more and more civilians are killed and brought into this conflict?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The tragedy in Sri Lanka has claimed 70,000 lives in the course of the conflict there. It's a conflict which is actually against the interests of all of Sri Lanka's communities, which could find a way to live together if they had representation that was able to eschew violence and look for political solution. I certainly assure him that we are using all of our best efforts to achieve that. I think it's deeply to be regretted that the appointment of an envoy has not yet been met with a welcome in Colombo, but that's certainly what we're working for.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But will that envoy be able to help us to ensure that Ban Ki-moon's commitment to supporting a ceasefire which can enable civilians to leave the hot areas in Sri Lanka can actually happen? Because families in Britain are really anxious about relatives about whom they've heard nothing for months, and we need to help them and their relatives to be safe.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend speaks with knowledge and passion about this issue, and she's absolutely right about the need to do everything that we can to protect the civilians, including working with the UN. I think that there are very, very distressing reports of both sides interfering with the ability of civilians to find safety. And it's certainly at the heart of our concerns, not just to try to provide money, but to try to provide some space where the civilians can escape and be given proper safety, because the situation there is deeply distressing, not just to people in the region, but to many, many people in the UK.
Elfyn Lwyd. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but some of the signals coming from the Sri Lankan government imply that they're quite prepared to go ahead with acts of genocide. And this, at time, is of the essence. I understand the Right Honourable Gentleman is doing what he can, but clearly many, many of us are deeply worried about what's going on there. And as time goes by, it's getting worse. Maybe the next fortnight will be crucial. I urge him, please, to think again about every possible avenue to avert this horrible humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman raises an important point. Sri Lanka does have a democratic government, and as I've said in another context, the standards that are expected of democratic governments are rightly high, and they should be adhered to by every single government. And it seems to me that the point that he's making towards the Sri Lankan government is absolutely right. No one is denying that there is a terrorist problem in Sri Lanka. That terrorist problem is a mortal threat to Sri Lankans of all communities. But the resolution of that terrorist problem cannot be achieved at the expense of the rights of minority communities in Sri Lanka, and that is what we're trying to work on.
Andy Love.
As the chairman of the Sri Lankan group in Parliament, can I welcome the appointment of the Right Honourable Member for Kilmarnock and wish my Right Honourable friend well in his discussions with the government there. Human Rights Watch has reported recently that 2,000 people have died and 5,000 have been injured, innocent civilians caught in the conflict. There are now reports that the so-called safe areas are no longer safe because conflict is proceeding there. I noted the comments that my Right Honourable friend has made. Will he redouble efforts for a humanitarian corridor that will allow innocent civilians to escape entirely from the area of conflict in the Vani?
Mr. Speaker, I recognise the work that my honourable friend has done as chairman of the Sri Lanka group. We will certainly work to explore all options for providing civilian safety, including a ceasefire, including a humanitarian corridor, including humanitarian safe zones. The situation does indeed get worse day by day, and the stories that emerge are of extreme cruelty. Cruelty, I have to say, on both sides, and it's very, very important that the international community does work on this issue. I should say that the unanimity of the EU's response yesterday is an important indication of how this issue is rising up the international agenda. Absolutely right.
Keith Simpson.
Mr. Speaker, we all obviously wish the Right Honourable Member for Kilmarnock and Loudon great success, but surely the reality is that the Sri Lankan government made it quite clear after the Prime Minister had announced his appointment that they had not been consulted, that they found the whole thing absolutely objectionable, and on Wednesday the 18th the Sri Lankan Cabinet met and refused to withdraw its opposition to the Right Honourable Gentleman's appointment. If this is so, then it means that either he personally is unacceptable, which I would find strange, or that the Special Envoy from the United Kingdom is unacceptable and will therefore be in permanent limbo.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry that the honourable gentleman has taken the position that he did, because following a letter from our Prime Minister to the President of Sri Lanka, I spoke to the President of Sri Lanka on the 30th of January, a long time before the date that the honourable gentleman mentioned, and the President Rajapaksa said that he would engage with a UK envoy. Two meetings between our High Commissioner and the President confirmed that position. So I think it's important that we don't leave on the record his suggestion that there was not consultation. There was indeed consultation about this issue, and that is why we're working hard to explain to the Sri Lankan government not just the virtues of the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Kilmarnock, but also the potential positive benefit of a UK envoy joining envoys from Japan, Norway and other countries playing a positive role in this conflict.
Dr. Starkey.
Among the civilian deaths in the north of Sri Lanka as a result of the Sri Lankan government's military action are 11 relatives of a member of the Milton Keynes Tamil Forum. What she wants to know is what justice there will be for her relatives killed in this action. Can the Foreign Secretary offer her any hope of that justice?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my constituent has lost, I think she said, 11 relatives, and I think it's impossible from this dispatch box to say anything that will give someone in that situation any sense of real comfort at a time of such huge distress. What I have to also say is that she is among a large number of people in this country who have lost large numbers of relatives in this terrible conflict. What I can assure her